The past year and a half has tested everyone's faith. Our faith in systems like government, public health, and justice have been tested. Even our sense of trust and civility within our own neighborhoods. But I'd argue that those tests of our collective faith have only been the starting point for more intimate and personal journeys. Grief, loneliness, and despair, anger, joy, and elation. We've dealt with all of these emotions a lot more as individuals and less in a shared community due to COVID-19. And those experiences have brought plenty of people closer to finding their spiritual center.
According to a survey by Pew, almost 30% of Americans say they feel more connected to their faith now than when the pandemic began. And those Americans polled said faith has started playing a stronger role in their lives over the past 18 months. Since the start of 2020, Americans, more than people in any other developed country, reported a growth in religious connections. This was during a time when churches, mosques, and temples were all closed.
For a lot of religious institutions, the trends of the past year have been something of a mixed blessing.
But COVID has really stretched us in ways that I don't think we could have imagined.
Tim Bathurst is the associate pastor at New Life Church, which is on Roosevelt Boulevard. He's been a resident and, at times, a real estate salesman in Olney for the last 30 years.
Well, it rocks your faith, which, let's be honest, in the United States of America, we're pretty comfortable all in all. We don't experience what a lot of the world experiences. And to have the United States be the one that's suffering the most in the pandemic is a new thing for us. And I wouldn't wish this upon anybody, but I'm a man of God. You don't get a pastor talking about God, We could be here for a long time. I think God is pushing a pause button on us. I think he's trying to say, slow down, pay attention to what's most important. Because I think in our society, probably because we are so comfortable, we don't often pay attention to those things unless we have to. Or unless we associate with people who struggle. And, I think one of the blessings of Olney for me as a pastor is I've had to become friends with people who struggle.
We interviewed Tim on November 2nd, 2020. New Life Church had just returned to a limited version of in-person worship.
Like it's been for everybody, it's been incredibly difficult. It's really messed us up quite a bit. We're just starting to get together. Our church has been more on the conservative side of things, so we just started getting together physically not terribly long ago. We would tape our services. We worked very hard to live stream our services, and our technology has just kept messing with us forever. And that was very discouraging to people. They didn't want to see, we would just kind of use tape music. They wanted to see the band. They wanted to see the musicians. And so we would try things, and it didn't work for us. We've lost a fair amount of people in our church. We've kind of rebounded, but a lot of people have left.
Just the pandemic and the distance that made things hard. The protests and politics of last summer were also having a major effect on his ministry.
But I think people, it's hard when you can't see people face to face. When we were in lockdown, people were going crazy, stir crazy. And so a little easier, but I think it really has, I think what COVID did to our church, not just COVID, but the racial strife, I think it showed the the fault lines in our church, the fault lines in our leadership, which I ultimately think is a good thing. Sometimes you rest on your laurels and something like this happens and you realize, no, I have to grow up more than I think I do. And I have to learn more, and it's good to be humbled by life sometimes.
Some of the older members of the church, many of whom had lived in Olney for most of their lives, saw the events of last year through one lens. Younger members of the church viewed it through another.
But you don't get to see the people you see on a weekly basis. It's hurt our church. And I think the racial injustices in our society have hurt even more. It's really, we've had to really work through that, because we're a pretty diverse church, and we want to look more and more like the Olney community. So you can imagine, I'll be glad when the election is over.
Tim and the rest of the leadership at New Life Church were not only trying to keep a community together during a trying time. Amidst the pandemic, they were also pushing ahead with long-term plans to inject more youth, diversity, and fresh energy into the church.
You know, in the 90s, we were the young adult church. We didn't have very many older people, and then we all got old. And then in the 90s, there weren't many young adult churches, but there's plenty of young adult churches now. And so a lot of young people want to be with people who are like them themselves, which I get. So there's just not as many younger people in our church, but we've changed. You're trying to change that pretty radically. We're trying to pass on this church to the next generation, and so we're making pretty significant changes to make it more appealing to a younger generation.
Tim's church has tried an exercise to reimagine what the community should and could be, and give members a voice in that.
Yes, praise God. Okay, ready? Yeah, come up to me. Go.
How many people are involved in the ministry? How many leaders are involved? And does it serve the community?
Are there other churches or organizations in the area where people could go to have the same need met?
What criteria will we use to identify what ministries are essential?
Similarly, what are the ministry goals that will be used to decide on what ministries we want to achieve our vision?
What is the real benefit that is obtained by having children leave the service for chapel hour and Kids Connection? And is that a benefit that outweighs the cost?
On what are we basing the essentials, and who will decide that?
Does the ministry effectively draw people in and then deepen their relationship with the Lord?
What does essential mean?
This is what Tim calls a question burst. It's an exercise in which various members of the church brainstorm and then recite questions about how the church is doing things.
How do we combine instead of reduce ministries?
As a ministry leader, can you sacrifice your ministry for the vision?
What if we make all these changes and still don't attract the neighborhood?
What does it add that can't be replaced?
How do we care for the inner life of individuals of all colors during this transition, especially if we don't talk to them?
How do a group of overwhelmed, run-down people get motivated to be in new ministries?
What ministries would we pick to have if we had none right now?
Did anybody ask the millennials what they want, or are we assuming?
This audio mirrors the intense internal monologues that we've all been having during the pandemic. This kind of rapid-fire, roller coaster ride of thinking that sometimes raises doubts about both the present and the future. But as Tim reminds us, doubts are a normal part of the human process. Doubting can even be essential to finding one's faith.
I think ultimately, this may sound strange, but I thank God for all of it, because I'm able to identify more with people who struggle. And there's a lot of people who struggle. And it's too easy to look down on people who struggle and who are weak. But if I'm truly a pastor, a Christian pastor, following Christ, then weakness shows strength. Where I am weak, He is strong, God is strong. And so it's just a much different viewpoint when you're side by side with people who are struggling.
The struggles of faith during the pandemic and how that's impacted spirituality and worship in Olney. That's coming up in this episode.
Before William Penn colonized what we now know as the state of Pennsylvania in the late 17th century, the Olney section of Philadelphia was home to a community of Lenape Indians. These particular Lenape were known to be tall, incredibly peaceful, and a spiritual people. Their totem was a turtle, because they had a legend that at one point the entire world balanced on the back of a giant turtle. They shared a name with the language they spoke, the Unami, which means people downriver. Olney is remarkably different today, of course. The people downriver, the Unami, were displaced long ago by English colonists. And in the context of modern Philly, the neighborhood is something of an upriver community. On a map, Olney lies at the tippy top of the city. It borders Montgomery County and is the second to last stop on the northbound Broad Street subway line. But the neighborhood is also upriver in the sense that it doesn't seem shy to go against the current. It's a neighborhood with a blue-collar tradition that's been revitalized in recent decades, but without the levels of gentrification that we've seen in so many other parts of the city. Over the last 20 years, Olney has become increasingly non-white. It's a true melting pot, home to large communities of Korean, Colombian, and Mexican immigrants, along with families from Africa and the Caribbean. Researchers believe it is the most linguistically diverse part of Philadelphia. More than 1 in 3 people who live there was born outside the United States. In this podcast, we're going to introduce you to some of them and hear why this neighborhood is so special. You'll also hear about the history of Olney, including the racism some people faced as the neighborhood grew less white. You'll hear from chefs and artists, teenagers and teachers, pastors and nonprofit leaders. You'll hear about its food, its thriving business community, and its built environment. A co-production of Olney Culture Lab of Culture Trust Greater Philadelphia and Amber Art and Design, in partnership with June Lopez and Malcolm Burnley. This is Audio Olney, a podcast exploring the beauty, complexity, and diversity of the Olney section of Philadelphia. We hope you enjoy. Major support for the Audio Olney podcast is provided by the Independence Public Media Foundation. Additional support is provided by the William Penn Foundation and Collins Family ShopRite.
Spirituality is such a broad topic. We knew coming into this episode that it'd be impossible to explore even a fraction of the ways that faith exists and is practiced in Olney. In the end, we decided to focus this episode around one particular religious tradition in Olney, because it's a practice you rarely hear about and is often misunderstood. The conversation showcases the incredible diversity of beliefs in the neighborhood. I'm talking about Voodoo.
Before we take you to that conversation, we thought it was important to share a little about our own relationship with spirituality, if only to illustrate how differently faith and religion look for different people.
I think spirituality dates back to the unknown and the mythos, and really a way to reflect and calculate the things that we can't really grasp and explain. It's that way of explaining the unknown, whether it be the cosmos or ultimately one of the true roots of spirituality, what happens to us when we die and where do we come from.
As usual, we recorded these thoughts in the woods, which is not only a happy place for us, but also a spiritual sanctuary.
So for me and my upbringing, nature has always embodied that realm of spiritual escape and really the environment that procures that type of state of being has always been most naturalized out in the woods, out alone in the woods, really just gathering the thoughts of the true earth. And so I wanted to ask you, Linda, being an artist, what is that meeting grounds of cultural expression and just the influences of the spirits, being an artist and doing what artists do?
I think for me, it's a lot of my creative work is about connection. It's about bringing people together. I realized pretty early on as an artist that I'm not the type of person that can sit in a room and make a painting by myself for several hours each day. My practice is really about being with other people and creating together. So I think that spirituality, that's how spirituality shows in my creative practice. It's really this connection between people, sharing stories, working together, learning from each other. As artists, we've seen countless examples of spirituality being found in day-to-day life. Culture and spirituality are so intertwined, but most people talk about them as if they're totally separate.
But I think most people, without even realizing, couple up their artistic expressions and practices as a part of their lifestyle, but they just don't wave their own flag about it, or they don't get the attention probably that they deserve in their daily rituals of cultural practice. But all that kind of wavers the line of spirituality as well.
The belief that there's something spiritual in every facet of our modern lives and that spirits are not some supernatural force is essential to understanding the African-based tradition of Voodoo. That's according to the experts at Le Perry-style Haitian Sanctuary in Olney, which according to the group is the first Voodoo church to achieve 501c3 status in the United States. The voice you're about to hear is Gros Mambo Yaseze Rimin Novayon Aidezal.
This is Yazezi. We, Gros Mambo Angela Novayon Aidezal, incorporated Le Perry-style Haitian Sanctuary in the late 80s. She went into Haiti and brought this religion back in its authentic form from Marianne, Haiti. One of the things in the Voodoo, the Haitian Voodoo religion, is we trace our lineage back. We can go back 500 years for those who have practiced this in our line.
The Le Perry-style Haitian Sanctuary is located right next to Cherifort Park, a stone's throw from Olney. It was founded by a woman named Gros Mambo Angela Novayon Aidezal, who continues to lead the organization. We spoke to 4 of her spiritual colleagues, including Mambo Yasezi.
She brought this back intact, uncorrupted, untainted by anything or any other religion. She brought it back in its pure form. The way that we celebrate and worship and together is in the old traditional way. We fellowship together, and then each one of us that you're speaking with today, have our own clientele, our own fellowshippers, and those who practice with us. But we all are under the umbrella of Gros Mambo Angela Novayon Aidezal.
You're going to hear a lot of terms, mambo and ongan, in this conversation. These are the titles bestowed upon priestesses and priests in the Haitian Voodoo religion, as Gros Mambo Pakwesa Novayon Aidezal explains.
Hi, this is Pakwesa. And so like I said, I was pretty much born into the faith since I was a young child, christened into the faith. This is like pretty much all I know, And when I went to Haiti when I was 11, we say mambo, it means a high priestess, the female high priestess. We say hungan, that means a male high priestess. So each one of us at some point went to Haiti to become initiated and follow the path of the Voodoo faith under the tutelage of Gros Mambo. So I was the youngest. I got initiated when I was 14 years old. I'm now 25.
She went on to explain how voodoo is an ancient and earthly religion.
You know, we believe in God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, as some may say as holy forces and deities and different names of that sort. But it is an earthly religion that focuses on the each force has a territory of a natural or nature, one that may govern the ocean, one that may govern the rain, and different elements of the earth that offer different paths of healing. And that's one thing that Other Parastyle specializes in is divination. Many people come for readings and healings via herbs. And these herbs are straight from Haiti.
One of the biggest misunderstandings about voodoo is that it's polytheistic, a practice of worshiping more than one god, when in reality, it's a monotheistic belief system that has a lot of overlap with Christianity and other Western practices.
Also, I had a many fights in my college years about voodoo being looked at as polytheistic. And I'll make that clear that it's monotheistic. The hierarchy is God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Forces. So some people say, oh, how can you pray the Holy Force? But a Christian will pray the Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost. And it's the same principle.
Voodoo leaves room for the idea that while there is one God, there are additional spirits and forces that govern certain aspects of our lives, particularly our relationship with nature.
So then you have a force that pop our way, who we say governs the wind, direction. And people ask that, when they ask him to put the wind at their back to help them find the direction they're supposed to go into. They have one that pop in Nambala. Some in Orisha may know as Obatala. And in Catholic or Christianity, they may call Moses. That's a relation there. He governs the rain and the health and peace, mind. He helps with illnesses. People go to him to better their health. So there's many of them. The Papa Ogun, he's known all over the world. In China, they may know him as Gu. In Yoruba and Nigeria, they'll call him Ogun. He is known worldly. And you break these down. You can even go into Hinduism. You can go into Greek mythology and find the correlations of these forces and what they govern.
Because of this overlap, many people who practice voodoo around the world also practice other religions. You'll find people who identify as Catholic or Protestant and also practice voodoo. For example, they are compatible.
And yet, in popular culture throughout the West, voodoo has been treated as if it's strange or unrecognizable, even dangerous. Gro Ongon Foknom Puen Novayon Airezal of the Le Peristyle Sanctuary explains the roots of that othering in Western society.
If you go back in the day, when Napoleon was trying to take over Haiti, he was ran out of Haiti. Remember, at one point, Haiti was one of the most powerful countries in the world. They had a seat at the table. They was responsible for coffee. It was one of the richest countries in the world. And Napoleon came in and tried to take over. When Napoleon tried to take over, it was a service. It was a voodoo service that was done that ran him out of there. Ever since that time, as you can see, in Western culture, they have tried to demoralize voodoo. They have tried to downgrade voodoo because of that. Because Haiti was, at one point, you can research this, was one of the strongest countries in the world. So the misconception comes from, and I'm just going to be very candid. You couldn't like make these black people slaves. You couldn't make them submit to what the other world was doing, like what everybody else was doing. So because of that, for all these years, there was this misconception about voodoo, about dolls and about raising the dead and everything like that. And like Paquesa, I've been raised in African-based religions since I was born into this. And I've seen the healings, I've seen miracles. And one thing about this ain't magic. This is faith in God. We have had people that are Muslims, Christians, all types of people that have came to get work done. So the misconception comes from just a point of not being suppressed. And that's what it really comes down to. It just comes from not being suppressed and standing up for what is correct. Like we said, we believe in God. We believe in Jesus Christ. We believe in the laws. We celebrate Christmas. And when I say we celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Christmas. We celebrate Easter. We celebrate Thanksgiving. We celebrate the New Year's. So the misconception is just coming from the media. And I don't mean to sound like some righteous person or something like that. But that's where the misconception comes from.
Basically, voodoo was part of a culture that resisted colonialism, and the negative stereotyping of voodoo became a way for colonizing forces to disempower native or indigenous people who practiced it.
And that's where you get the false narrative around voodoo dolls.
There is no such thing as a voodoo doll. And let me say where people think where that comes from. It's something called a paquette. A paquette is an implement. It's a spiritual implement that, like as Free mentioned, divination. Divination is one of the biggest tools we use. You know, any business, you may have a person who is your counselor or your financial guider, whatever. Divination gives you that guidance. It gives you a blueprint of a reading of what your destiny is going to be. So a paquette is an instrument used in the process of divination. And it's beautiful. And it looks like it has sequins wrapped around it. And it will look like it might be an arm. But it's all sequins and it's cloth. And it's we can show you a picture of it on our different multiple websites. But in Haiti, because they don't have the many resources as we do in America, they use pins to hold the sequins and the tassels and different decorations on it because they don't have a sewing machine, they don't have tape and different things like that. So the pin is what holds it to the cloth. And then you may see, when you hear voodoo, you might hear of like, A&E or different, New Orleans voodoo. And that's all entertainment purposes, like the woo, to get people to maybe, click in or just to give that aspect of what people want to see. They spice it up some, but that's not the true culture. Every different culture may have a different fallacy that's placed onto it that may have made money at some point, but it's not the truth of the pureness of the religion. And many misconceptions comes from New Orleans or different movies that you may see in the idea of The Walking Dead, like Quando mentioned, and voodoo dolls. So I just wanted to clear that up as well.
In other words, voodoo dolls were an ancient form of clickbait, or even fake news.
Le Peristyle is a community space, just like any church or temple strives to be. They do financial counseling, fertility counseling, and all forms of guidance. Gros Mambo Esprit Maloisa Novayon Airezal explains that.
This is Esprit. One thing I would love to add to that is that when Gros Mambo formulated Le Peristyle Haitian sanctuary was a word that she definitely wanted to put out there to say a place where people can find rest. I love Le Peristyle. I come from a Christian background. So, coming into African-based tradition, it was entirely different from, what I knew and how I was raised. But one thing that I love about it is that it was just so open and it embraced me with open arms. And not only did I know is that African-based religion embraced me, but embraced every other culture, every other, denomination, religion. It didn't matter who you were, what background you came from, we embraced you. And that's one thing that led me to Le Peristyle. And that's one thing that I love about the Voodoo religion, because the Voodoo religion is an old religion, it's an old tradition, is earthly. And there's over 55 traditions worldwide that can actually, find some similarities and commonalities within the Voodoo religion that, compared to what they are doing. And also, Voodoo offers an opportunity for change. At Le Peristyle, it's not about conversion or anything like that. It's all about healing and health and elevation. And that's one thing that I love about Gros Mambo Angela, because that's what she instilled in all of her godchildren, all of her priests, to service the people and to look at a person as a person who just needs healing, just like one day, we did when we first came through those doors.
There were so many incredible takeaways from this conversation. The group shared a powerful story about a woman who was in a wheelchair for years, but through the natural healing of voodoo, was able to get up and eventually take a few steps. They also shared how voodoo translates to holy and of God, the opposite of the Western connotation of the religion. I came away appreciating the similarities between voodoo and other religions. And if you still don't believe that, listen to this bit from our conversation with Ongan Foknom Puen talking about the pandemic.
We are not taking this lightly at all, because at the end of the day, this is a plague. And when I say a plague, this is what God has put on the world to put the world at a halt so everybody can get themselves together, because the world has gotten a little bit out of control.
That's very similar to how Pastor Tim sized up the pandemic at the beginning of this episode. Our spiritual practices and how they help us interpret the world share a lot more in common than they do differences.
And that's one of the reasons why the founder of Le Peristyle Haitian Sanctuary, Gromambo Angela Novayon Arezal, also founded the National African Religious Congress, which is also based right here in Olney. It is a worldwide organization that advocates for tolerance and education around African-based religions.
All of this is happening in Olney. All of this. This is from Olney to Nigeria, Olney to Cuba, Olney to Haiti, Olney to the world, basically. And it's happening right here in this area.
You can find out more about the National African Religious Congress at narcworld.com. You can also find more information about Le Peristyle Sanctuary at leperistyle-haitiansanctuary.com. The website for Tim Bathurst's New Life Church is newlifephilly.net. This episode features music from Thurgood Marshall Elementary School Choir performing a rousing rendition of Joy in My Heart at the Olney Choir Festival in 2019.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Olney. In the next episode, we're going to explore food in Olney. You can find more information about our guest work and this project at www.olneyculturelab.org and search for the Audio Olney podcast. You can also email us at audioolney@gmail.com. Be safe, everyone.
To close out this episode, we wanted to share a very special rendition of the traditional spiritual Amazing Grace, arranged by Professor Randy J. Gibson and performed by Professor Gibson with Eunice China on violin.